The air above Lake Tahoe was sharp with pine and memory when Richard Coleman turned off the highway and onto the narrow road that led to his villa. The afternoon light poured gold across the hood of his black Mercedes, catching the edge of his reflection in the windshield. 63 tired, and still carrying himself like the man who had once built half the city's west side brick by brick. He smiled as he approached the gate, expecting the usual quiet, a few birds, the creak of wind through the trees, and the stillness of water that mirrored the sky. This place had been his refuge for years, the home he'd built with Claire, the one woman who ever believed his calm could outlast the world's noise. But today the stillness broke before he even parked. 2 unfamiliar SUVs sat in the driveway, dusted with road salt. On the terrace above, laughter rippled high, careless, and wrong. Richard stepped out slowly, his hand tightening around the strap of his weekend bag. For a long moment he only listened, the scrape of chairs, the clink of glass, the echo of voices that did not belong here. Then he saw her, Amelia, his daughter. Her honey-brown skin glowed in the sunlight, her hair straightened into the same sleek curtain her mother used to call Hollywood armor. She stood with her arm around a tall white man in linen shorts, Daniel Whitmore, her husband, and behind them lounged 2 older figures sipping coffee as though on their own veranda. Dad, Amelia called, surprised but not embarrassed. Her voice carried a sharp brightness that felt rehearsed. "What are you doing here?" Richard blinked, unsure he'd heard her right. "What am I doing here?" His voice came out rough, scraped with disbelief. "It's my house." Daniel shifted uneasily, glancing at the older couple. "We just thought you were staying in the city this weekend." Amelia stepped forward, her tone switching to that polite condescension he'd first noticed after her wedding. "Dad, I didn't think you'd mind. We wanted to give Mom's place some life again." Daniel's parents drove all the way from Santa Barbara. The woman on the terrace, Margaret Whitmore, smiled faintly, without standing. "It's such a lovely property. You must be proud, Mr. Coleman." The way she said Mr. Coleman landed like a test, a measured civility that left no room for equality. Richard nodded once, jaw tightening. "I am, which is why I'd like to spend my weekend in it." Amelia's face hardened. "Dad, you can't stay here. We already made plans. They just got comfortable." "Comfortable," Richard repeated quietly. He looked at the mugs on the table, the half-opened suitcase near the door, the floral robe draped across a chair that wasn't hers. "You mean they've moved in?" Daniel raised his hands, trying for diplomacy. "Let's not make this awkward." But awkward had already curdled into something darker. The smell of ownership denied the echo of every meeting where Richard had been mistaken for the driver, every handshake that came late after a glance at his skin. "I drove 2 hours," he said. "All I want is the peace I paid for." Amelia's eyes flashed the same green flecks as her mother's, but colder. "Please don't make this a thing. You've got plenty of properties. Let us use this one. Let you—" Richard's voice dropped an octave. "I built this one." Margaret set down her cup with a delicate click. "Amelia, dear, maybe we should give him space to—" "No," Amelia snapped, cutting her off. "He doesn't get to guilt me for wanting family harmony. Mom would have wanted this." That name Mom cracked something open inside him. For a moment he saw Claire standing where Amelia stood now, her laughter carrying through unfinished walls while paint dried on her fingers. "Let's make it bright," she'd said back then. "Let's make it ours." Richard looked at his daughter and saw none of her mother's warmth. Only distance polished and learned. "Your mother wanted peace," he said softly. "Not erasure." Amelia crossed her arms. "You're overreacting. This house doesn't have to be your shrine." The silence that followed felt like winter settling on water. Even the birds seemed to pause. Richard picked up his bag again, his shoulders heavy but steady. "I'll come back another time," he said finally. Her relief was immediate, too visible. "Thank you, Dad. I knew you'd understand." He walked back down the gravel path toward his car, the crunch underfoot louder than their whispers behind him. When he reached the gate, he paused, turning just long enough to see Amelia laugh at something Daniel said. Margaret was already on her phone, maybe texting friends about the charming lake house they'd borrowed. Sunlight spilled across them like blessing, indifferent and bright. Richard started the engine and the villa disappeared in the mirror behind him, the terrace, the laughter, the trespass shrinking until it was only a blur against the mountains. He thought of Claire's voice on the last night before she died. "Promise me you'll keep that house. Promise me you won't let them take what we built." He had promised, and he never broke promises. But as the road curved toward the highway and the lake vanished from view, Richard Coleman realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit in years. It wasn't just strangers who took things from men like him. Sometimes it was family. The highway stretched ahead like a long gray confession. Richard's hands rested on the steering wheel, steady but tense the same way they had been during every negotiation, every insult disguised as courtesy, every moment he had learned to absorb instead of react. He'd spent his life mastering silence. It had protected him in boardrooms where his voice was tolerated, but never truly heard in neighborhoods where success made his presence suspect, and in a marriage where love had always been shadowed by people's curiosity about how a black man ended up with a white woman like Claire. But the silence felt different now. It was heavy, cruel a silence that mocked his patience. 2 hours back to Oakland, and every mile carried the echo of Amelia's voice. "You can't stay here. You have plenty of properties. Let us use this one." Her words looped in his mind, soft and sharp all at once, like a knife polished to gleam in daylight. He remembered when she was 7 running barefoot across the villa's unfinished floors streaked with sawdust. "Daddy, when it's done, can I paint my room purple?" He had laughed. "You can paint it any color you want, princess." That same room he imagined now probably held Margaret Whitmore's luggage. At a red light, Richard's gaze drifted toward his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked older than he felt, or maybe exactly as tired as he should have been. The city skyline rose faintly in the distance, gray against gray. Claire used to call it beautiful. He saw it for what it was, the battlefield where he'd learned to survive. When he'd started Coleman Properties in the late 1980s, people had smiled politely and asked if he was working under someone. When he bought his first apartment complex, the loan officer had said, "That's ambitious for a man like you." He had smiled then, too, swallowed the insult and signed anyway. He'd made himself undeniable, but never untouchable. And now his own daughter was proving it. He parked in front of his townhouse, smaller, quieter than the villa, and sat in the car for several minutes before stepping out. The neighborhood was peaceful, mostly retirees and young couples. To them, he was the quiet widower with good taste in cars and a gardener who came twice a month. No one knew what he'd built. No one knew what he'd lost. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Claire's picture still sat on the piano, her smile caught mid-laughter, her hair falling over one eye. He had taken that photo the first summer after they married, both of them broke but happy. "Be patient with her," she used to say about Amelia. "She's growing up between two worlds. She needs time to know who she is." He had believed that. He had given her all the time in the world. But somewhere along the way, Amelia stopped being between two worlds and chose the one that didn't include him. He poured a glass of scotch, let it rest on the counter without drinking. The quiet tick of the wall clock filled the room. Claire had insisted on that clock, said the sound made a house feel alive. Now it only marked how long he'd been alone. He thought about calling Amelia again, demanding an explanation, but the thought died before it could form. She would just call him dramatic, old-fashioned, overprotective, words she'd used before in that measured tone she'd learned from Daniel. He'd heard enough tones like that in his life tones that said you're overreacting when what they really meant was you don't matter enough to be upset. Richard sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. His company's website filled the screen, clean lines, proud photographs of every project he'd completed. Shopping centers, housing developments, the villa gleaming by the lake, its caption reading, "Designed and built by Richard and Claire Coleman, 2001. He stared at that caption until the letters blurred. Then he closed the lid. The phone on his desk buzzed a reminder for a meeting he'd canceled weeks ago. He ignored it, leaned back, and closed his eyes. He could almost hear Claire's voice again. "You can't let bitterness build in you, Rich. It's like mold. It spreads quiet and fast." He smiled sadly. She had always seen the rot before it showed. But this wasn't bitterness. It was something else, something older, heavier, forged from decades of proving himself in a country that always asked for proof again. He realized for the first time that Amelia had grown up in two separate realities. In hers, the world had always been open college friends, travel all buffered by the comfort of having a white mother and a father who'd already fought the wars she never had to see. In his survival had been a full-time job. The silence in the house pressed against him again. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the street where a delivery van was parked beside a blooming cherry tree. A young couple held hands laughing as they carried boxes inside their new home. Their laughter was clean, untouched by history. He envied them for a moment. Then he caught his reflection again. Dark skin, gray hair, eyes that had learned to calculate risk faster than emotion. He thought of Amelia's face that afternoon, the way she'd looked at him, not with anger, but embarrassment. That was the part that hurt most. For her, his existence had become inconvenient. He whispered to the empty room, "I built everything to make her proud." The words came out cracked, "And she's ashamed anyway." The glass of scotch sat untouched beside him, its surface trembling faintly with the rhythm of his breath. Outside, night deepened over the city, swallowing the horizon. Richard watched it happen without turning on the lights. When the last trace of daylight vanished, he finally spoke aloud, not to Claire, not to Amelia, but to himself. "I'm done being quiet." 3 days passed before the phone rang. Richard had almost convinced himself Amelia would call to apologize, or at least to explain. The hope lingered, like an ache he couldn't stretch out of his bones. When her name finally lit up his phone, he hesitated. His thumb hovered over the answer button longer than it should have. Then he pressed it. "Dad," she said. Her voice was brisk, polished, the tone she used at business luncheons when she wanted to sound older than she was. "We need to talk about the villa." Richard exhaled slowly. "I figured that was coming." There was a pause, a click of breath, the faint sound of a car door closing in the background. "I've made a decision," she continued. "Daniel's parents are moving in, permanently." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean, moving in? They need stability," Amelia said, her voice clipped with efficiency, like she was giving a presentation. "Their lease in Santa Barbara ended, and honestly, it just makes sense. You hardly use the villa, and they—" He cut her off. "That's my house, Amelia." Her tone sharpened. "You never even go there anymore. You have other places, other investments. You can't keep everything to yourself." "I earned that house," Richard said quietly. "Every nail, every tile. Your mother and I—" "Oh, here we go," she interrupted. "You and Mom. Always about the past." He froze. There was no malice in her tone, just boredom, the kind that comes from distance. "Claire would never have." "Mom isn't here, Dad," Amelia snapped. "And you can't keep treating everything like it's sacred just because she touched it once. We're moving forward. You should too." Richard stared at the phone as if it might explain what he'd just heard. "You're giving my house away to your husband's family. Their family too," she insisted. "You're always talking about legacy. Well, this is legacy connection unity." He could almost hear Daniel in those words, the calm, rehearsed persuasion of someone used to being listened to. "Unity," Richard repeated. "By taking what doesn't belong to you. Oh, come on. You've got more than enough. Don't make this ugly. Ugly." The word stung, as if protecting what he built was unbecoming of him, as if anger itself was something he wasn't allowed. "Amelia," he said, voice low now. "Do you even hear yourself?" "I'm trying to help them," she said. "They've had a hard year. Margaret lost her job and Daniel's dad." "You're helping them with my property," he interrupted. "And you didn't even ask." Her sigh hissed through the line. "You always turn everything into drama. This is practical. You wouldn't understand." He leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrest until his knuckles whitened. "Say what you really mean," he said quietly. "You think I don't belong there." She hesitated. The silence stretched heavy as a verdict. Finally, she said, "You make things complicated, Dad. You always have. The villa is supposed to be peaceful." Peaceful. The word hit like a slap. Peaceful for who he wanted to ask. For the white family who could drink coffee on his terrace without drawing stares. For his daughter who could pretend the house hadn't been built by a black man's hands and a white woman's love. He forced the words through gritted teeth. "You can't just decide I'm not part of my own life anymore." Amelia's voice dropped, controlled, but cold. "You're being selfish. You've done well for yourself. It's time to think about others for a change." The irony nearly made him laugh. "Others," he said softly. "That's what I am now, isn't it? One of the others." "Don't twist my words," she snapped. "You don't need to twist a knife that's already deep," he said. Her composure cracked for a moment. "Why do you always make me feel guilty for wanting something different, for not wanting to be boxed into your world?" He could hear it then, not just arrogance, but shame, the kind that doesn't announce itself but leaks through like smoke. "I gave you everything I never had," he said. "And you think that makes you better than me? I think it makes me free," she said, almost whispering. There it was, the truth. Richard sat in silence, the hum of the city filling the space between them. He could hear traffic through her phone, the life she lived away from him, fast, bright, polished. "Amelia," he said finally, steady but shaking inside. "You can't give away what you didn't earn." "I already did," she said. The line went dead. Richard stayed seated for a long time after that, staring at the phone screen gone dark. Outside, a plane cut across the night sky, its lights blinking red and white against the black. He remembered the first time he taught Amelia how to ride a bike, how she'd fallen and skinned her knees, and he'd told her pain is proof you're learning. Now he wasn't sure what this pain was proof of. He rose, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a framed photograph of the villa, sunlight over glass, Claire's laughter frozen beside him. For the first time, he noticed something in that photo he hadn't, before his hand resting on the balcony rail, rough from years of work next to Claire's pale, delicate fingers. 2 colors, 1 promise. He ran a thumb across the frame and whispered to the empty room. "She gave it away, Claire. Just gave it away." The whisper barely reached the walls, but it carried something new. Not grief this time. Something colder, clearer. Resolve. The next morning broke gray and quiet, a sky heavy with unshed rain. Richard woke early, long before dawn, as he always had when there was work to do. But now there were no meetings, no calls, no deals, just an ache that wouldn't let him sleep. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling into the air. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. It was the kind of silence that made memory loud. He found himself reaching back to the beginning, not of the argument, but of everything. Before the villa, before Coleman Properties, before Claire, before he'd learned that patience could be both armor and prison. He was 25 when he started working on construction sites, hauling rebar, mixing cement, listening to men who thought jokes about his skin were just part of the culture. They laughed easily back then, unthreatened, because they never thought he'd rise above them. But Richard didn't laugh. He listened, learned, remembered. He learned how foundation depth changed with soil type, how wood warped when left in damp air, how to read blueprints upside down because the foreman never turned them his way. By 30, he was a site manager. By 35, he was buying his first plot of land. He still remembered that meeting at the bank the first time he walked in, wearing a suit that fit too well for their expectations. The loan officer, a middle-aged man with a red tie, glanced at Richard's paperwork, then at Richard. "Are you sure you understand the terms?" he'd asked, smiling as though explaining something to a child. Richard had smiled back. "I wrote them." The loan was approved 2 weeks later, reluctantly, quietly, but it was his. That property became his first small apartment complex. It wasn't glamorous, but it was proof. Every brick laid was a brick wrestled from a system that wanted him invisible. When he met Claire, he was already halfway through building his second project, a commercial space in downtown Oakland. She was an interior designer working on another job nearby, blonde hair, tied back, blue eyes, steady. She'd asked if she could see his blueprints, and instead of dismissing her curiosity, he'd handed them over. "You draw bold," she said that first day. "Most men are afraid of open space." He'd laughed. "Most men are afraid of what fills it." It had been that simple. 2 people who'd learned to live on opposite sides of the same invisible wall. They married quietly without permission or spectacle. Her parents didn't come. His mother had warned him, the world doesn't change just because love feels easy. But Claire had been brave in the quiet everyday ways. She fought their fights in rooms he couldn't always enter. When realtors tried to speak only to her, she redirected the conversation. When clients called him the help, she corrected them without flinching. And when he told her about his dream, a home by the lake, a space untouched by judgment, she didn't hesitate. "We'll build it," she said, "from the ground up." The land had been nothing then, a stretch of wild grass and rock. The locals said the ground was too uneven, too costly to shape, but Richard had seen it differently, a challenge that would hold his name in it long after he was gone. For months he and Claire drove up every weekend. They designed it themselves, room by room. He laid the foundation with his own crew, worked 12-hour days, and fell asleep beside Claire on a cot under unfinished beams. They cooked on a camp stove, ate out of paper bowls, and watched the stars from what would one day be their living room. When the first walls went up, Claire painted one corner by hand, a single streak of yellow that caught the morning light. "So we remember the sun, even on cold days," she said. Richard built the staircase himself, sanding every edge until it felt like silk under bare feet. He installed the glass doors with precision, so the lake always stayed visible from the main room. Every detail mattered. Every nail held a memory. He remembered the day the house was finished. Claire stood by the window, hair loose, barefoot on the new hardwood floor. "It's ours," she whispered. "No one can take this from us." He believed her. For years the villa had been a sanctuary, the place where he could breathe without looking over his shoulder. They hosted small gatherings there, friends, artists, neighbors. The house was alive with laughter, music, color. Even after Claire got sick, she insisted on going there. "This is where I can still see the sky," she'd said. "Don't let them turn it into something else." After she passed, Richard had honored that wish. The villa became sacred, not just a memory of love, but a monument to survival, a black man's testament that he could build beauty from a world that only ever expected endurance. Now sitting at his kitchen table, he ran a hand over the grain of the wood, remembering how Claire's fingers used to drum along it while she sketched designs. He could almost smell the sawdust again, feel the sting of sweat in his eyes as he worked beside her. Amelia had been 10 when the villa was finished. She'd spent summers there painting rocks by the lake, learning to swim, falling asleep to the sound of frogs and crickets. But over the years, she'd changed. Her laughter had grown careful. Her friends from college had come and gone, each one more polished than the last. She'd stopped inviting him to visit her campus after a white student mistook him for the chauffeur. He'd never told her how much that hurt. He should have. Now it was too late. He took another sip of coffee, cold now, and set the cup down. Then he reached for the old keyring hanging by the door. The villa's keys still gleamed smooth from years of use. He turned them over in his hand and whispered, "They'll learn what it means to take from me. Not with anger, not yet, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd built too much to be erased." By Monday morning, Richard had replaced his grief with focus. Grief was indulgent. Focus was survival. He woke early, shaved, and put on the same gray suit he used to wear to board meetings, not for show, but for discipline. When a man like him walked into an office, he needed to look like authority, not emotion. He drove downtown the city, half asleep under drizzle. The streets shimmered like steel under thin rain. He parked outside a modest law office on Broadway. Ung and Associates, a name known among Black and Asian business owners for quiet victories that never made headlines. Marcus Eng had represented him before during a zoning dispute in 2007, and again when a contractor tried to undercut him in 2013. Marcus wasn't flashy. He was precise, patient, and unshakable, the kind of man who knew how to fight without showing his fists. Inside the waiting room smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. The secretary nodded, already expecting him. "Mr. Coleman Marcus said to go right in." Richard stepped into the small office. Marcus looked up from a stack of files, glasses low on his nose, his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. He smiled, the kind that began in the eyes. "Richard," he said, "it's been too long." "Too long," Richard replied, shaking his hand. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "I read your message. You said it's about your daughter and some property." Richard sat, exhaled slowly, then told the story. The villa, the in-laws, the phone call, every detail that had left him hollow. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in the corner of a legal pad. When Richard finished, the lawyer leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "First question," he said. "Whose name is on the deed?" "Mine," Richard replied. "Has been since 2001. "Good. That simplifies things. She can't legally transfer ownership without your consent." Richard nodded but didn't relax. Legal isn't always enough. Marcus studied him for a moment. "You're right. The law and justice aren't always friends." He opened a folder, flipping through a few reference pages. "You mentioned her in-laws have moved in?" "Or will soon," Richard said. "They believe they belong there." Marcus frowned. "That's not just arrogance, it's strategy. If they establish residence mail bills possessions, it complicates eviction. The law protects occupancy even against ownership in the short term." Richard felt the heat rise in his chest. "They want to make it messy." Marcus nodded. "They want to make it theirs by living in it long enough that removing them looks cruel, especially if the narrative spins against you." The narrative, Richard repeated, bitterly amused. "A polite word for the story white folks tell each other." Marcus gave a grim smile. "Exactly. If this goes public, it won't be about property. It'll be about an angry black father versus a young couple in need. You'd be amazed how quickly sympathy follows skin tone." Richard stared out the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. "I'm not fighting this in their court of opinion," he said. "Not again." Marcus closed the folder. "Then we plan for permanence, not just defense." Richard looked back at him. "Go on." Marcus leaned forward. "There's a legal structure called a lifetime estate with charitable transfer. It allows you to keep full rights during your life, but on paper ownership passes to a nonprofit or trust. It makes your property untouchable by anyone else, family or not. You'll still live there, use it, rent it, but no one can inherit it without your will's approval." Richard's eyes narrowed. "So even if Amelia tries again, she can't." Marcus finished. "Not without public scandal and a court order that would embarrass her husband's family." Richard considered it. The idea wasn't revenge. It was order. Protection by intellect, not anger. "Draw it up," he said finally. Marcus nodded. "I will. But Richard, this won't heal what's between you and her." Richard gave a faint smile. "I'm not trying to heal it. I'm trying to stop the bleeding." For a moment, silence filled the office. The rain outside softened into mist, brushing against the glass like quiet applause. Marcus adjusted his glasses. "You've spent your whole life defending what you've built, haven't you?" "Not defending," Richard said. "Preserving." Marcus gave a thoughtful nod. "That's a harder word, and a lonelier one." Richard didn't argue. When the meeting ended, Marcus walked him to the door. "I'll send you documents by tomorrow," he said. "But Richard, one more thing." "Yes?" "You may win the legal war," Marcus said gently, "but make sure you don't lose your story. The way they talk about you matters less than the way you remember yourself." Richard paused at the doorway. "I've been remembered worse ways than true," he said. Marcus smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to write your own ending." Outside, the rain had stopped. The street gleamed puddles, catching light from the passing cars. Richard stood there for a moment, letting the cold air wash over him. He thought of Marcus's words about memory, about story. He had spent decades controlling every narrative around him. Every contract, every meeting, every handshake had been an act of translation, making himself palatable, professional, predictable. And yet his daughter, his own blood, had rewritten him anyway. He looked down at his reflection in the puddle silver hair, dark skin eyes hard as granite. "Not this time," he murmured. He stepped off the curb, crossing toward his car, his shoes slicing through water like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. The next day the clouds broke. Sunlight spilled through Richard's office window for the first time in a week, cutting sharp lines across the hardwood floor. He stood there a long while, staring at that light, trying to decide whether it meant anything. Then he picked up the phone. It was time to stop mourning and start building again, this time a different kind of structure. Not made of wood or concrete, but of people. He dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Derek," he said when the familiar voice answered. "You still know your way around a security grid?" A laugh came through the line, deep, warm, and steady. "You planning on keeping raccoons out or people in?" "Neither," Richard said. "I'm protecting what's mine. Then you know I'm in." Derek Lewis was a systems engineer, mid-40s, quiet brilliance behind thick glasses, the kind of man who'd been fixing things his whole life, starting with a Commodore computer in his grandmother's garage. They had met years ago when Richard hired him to automate energy systems for one of his commercial buildings. Derek was the kind of man who understood both circuits and motives. He knew that behind every request for security there was fear or history or both. When Richard arrived at his workshop that afternoon, Derek was already setting aside a pile of blueprints. The place smelled like solder and coffee. Screens glowed with lines of code, and a half-built drone rested on a steel table beside a pair of wire cutters. "Still building worlds from scratch," Richard said, stepping inside. "Somebody has to," Derek replied with a grin. "Now tell me, boss, who's threatening your world this time?" Richard told him everything: Amelia, Daniel, the Whitmores, the villa. By the time he finished, Derek's grin had faded. "So they're just moving in like it's theirs?" Derek asked, shaking his head. "Man entitlement like that should come with a warning label." "They think I'll just let it happen," Richard said. "They're used to people like me not making noise." Derek nodded slowly. "Then let's make noise the quiet way." He walked to the back of the workshop and pulled out a folder marked Private Installations. "You still have a live network in that villa, old one," Richard said. "Motion sensors. Basic. Then we'll upgrade. Invisible but absolute." He laid out a series of designs: remote locks, smart lighting, hidden cameras that blended with the architecture. "You'll control everything from your phone. If anyone tries to override it, the system logs the attempt and locks down." Richard studied the sketches. "I don't want harm," he said. "Just boundaries." Derek smiled. "Boundaries are exactly what they hate most." That evening, Richard drove to the local church, a place he hadn't visited since Claire's funeral. The building's wooden doors looked smaller than he remembered, as if grief had once made them larger. Inside the sanctuary was empty, except for Pastor Raymond, an old friend with a voice like gravel and mercy. "Richard Coleman," he said with a slow smile. "Haven't seen you since the world still had good jazz." "I need something," Richard said, his tone respectful but firm. "Not prayer, just perspective." Raymond gestured toward the pews. "Then sit. God listens better when we're not standing on ceremony." Richard sat. He told him about Amelia, about what she'd done. The pastor didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't fill the silence. When Richard finished, the older man leaned back and said softly, "You're not the first father to lose a child to shame." Richard looked up. "Shame, yes," Raymond said. "The kind they don't admit. The kind the world plants in them early tells them they'll never be enough until they forget where they came from." Richard's jaw tightened. "I raised her better." "You did," Raymond said. "But the world raises them too, and the world's got longer arms." They sat in silence a while longer. The light through the stained glass painted Richard's hands in shifting color, amber, red, blue. Raymond continued. "What are you going to do?" "Protect what's mine," Richard said, "without losing who I am." The pastor nodded. "Then do it with wisdom, not wrath. Let the lesson come from strength, not vengeance." "I've got both," Richard said, "but I'll try to choose right." 2 days later, Richard called the last name on his list Emilio Vargas, a contractor who had worked on the villa's foundation 20 years ago. Emilio was in his 60s now, slower, but still proud of his craft. When Richard explained the situation, Emilio didn't hesitate. "I remember that house," he said, "built like it was meant to last forever. You say the wrong people want it, then we'll remind them whose hands made it." By the end of the week, Richard had what Marcus Ung would call a human firewall. Derek, Raymond, Emilio, each representing a different piece of the armor he was building. Not just protection, but principle. Derek handled the technology, Emilio would reinforce the physical structures, hidden locks, tamper-proof circuits, and Pastor Raymond would witness the transfer of property when the time came, ensuring no one could say Richard acted in secret. It wasn't an army, it was something quieter, older, a brotherhood of men who had each learned to survive by building, not breaking. Late that night, Richard sat alone at his dining table, blueprints spread before him. Lines of defense drawn in pencil, annotated in Derek's careful handwriting. He ran his finger over the layout of the villa, every room, every door, every threshold he had built with Claire. The plan was precise, clean, controlled. But somewhere deep inside, he knew this was more than a property dispute. It was about being seen even when they wanted him invisible, about not letting history repeat itself, not through banks or politics or his own daughter's hands. He whispered to the empty house, "They want peace. I'll give them silence, the kind that teaches respect." Then he folded the blueprints, neatly turned off the light, and walked upstairs. The house settled around him like a living thing, old wood creaking air, humming with something new. A storm was coming, but this time it was his. For 2 weeks, Richard Coleman vanished from the world. No dinner invitations, no golf partners, no polite calls from business associates asking how retirement was treating him. He wanted no sympathy, no witnesses, only progress. Every morning he drove to the villa before sunrise. Derek met him there usually with a thermos of black coffee and a bag of tools that looked more like medical instruments than hardware. The air was cold, crisp, smelling of pine and damp soil. The house silhouetted against the lake stood like a question, waiting for its answer. They worked quietly. Derek rewired the lighting system to sync with voice recognition. Only Richard's commands could trigger full access. Sensors were embedded into walls invisible to the naked eye. Cameras disguised as fixtures monitored every angle without breaking the villa's aesthetic harmony. It wasn't paranoia, it was precision. Richard didn't believe in chaos. Chaos was how people like him lost what they'd built. One morning, while Derek adjusted the software interface, Richard stood by the main window looking at the water. "You ever think about why we build?" he asked. Derek didn't look up from his laptop. "Because nobody gives us anything worth keeping." Richard nodded slowly. "Then they call it arrogance when we hold on." Derek chuckled. "Only when it works." That line stayed with Richard for the rest of the day. By noon, Emilio arrived with his toolbox, his steps heavy from decades of labor. He inspected the doors and reinforced them with discreet steel bolts. "Won't see them," Emilio said, tapping one hinge with his hammer, "but you'll hear the difference when they close. Solid. Final." Richard smiled faintly. "That's how I like things." The two men worked in companionable silence for hours, their movements rhythmic, efficient. Each nail, each line of code, each sensor, a quiet declaration. "This is mine. You can enter only by respect." In the afternoons, Richard sat with Derek on the porch steps, going over the system diagnostics. The lake shimmered beneath the sun, indifferent to human conflict. "She used to sit here," Richard murmured once. Claire said this view made her feel like the world could still be kind. Derek looked up. "And you?" "I knew better," Richard said. Back in Oakland, Marcus Ng was handling the legal side of the plan. He called every few days to update Richard on the paperwork, the transfer documents, the foundation registration, the notary appointments. "It's all airtight," Marcus said during one late-night call. "By next month, the villa will be legally untouchable. You'll retain full rights to live there, but on paper the ownership moves to the Coleman Foundation for Housing Justice. No court or family member can challenge that easily." Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "Coleman Foundation," he repeated quietly. "Sounds almost too noble." Marcus's tone softened. "It's not about nobility, Richard. It's about reclaiming power the right way." He thought about that long after they hung up the right way. He'd spent his entire life doing things the right way, dressing better, speaking softer, working twice as hard. And yet no matter how right he'd been, the world always found a way to take what it wanted. This time, rightness would have muscle. The villa began to change in subtle ways. The hallways hummed faintly when Richard entered, sensors waking like nerves recognizing their master. The lights adjusted automatically to his footsteps. Even the air system was programmed to respond to his presence, cooling and warming by voice. He felt Claire would have approved not for the technology, but for the intention. She'd always told him that peace required boundaries, not apologies. On the final evening of setup, Derek tested the full lockdown protocol. "Ready?" he asked. Richard nodded. Derek tapped a few commands and the villa shifted. The doors sealed with a soft click. The shutters descended, blending into the facade. A low hum filled the air like the house itself taking a breath. Richard stood still, listening. "Feels alive," he said. "It is," Derek replied. "Every piece of it knows who you are. Anyone else tries to claim it, the house won't let them." Richard walked through the rooms slowly, the living area, the hall, the bedroom Claire had painted pale yellow. Everything looked the same, yet different, like memory reborn in armor. He paused by the window overlooking the lake. The reflection of his face floated in the glass dark against the fading light. "Let them come," he said quietly. "Let them see what ownership means." Derek closed his laptop. "You really think they'll try again?" Richard turned his expression calm but certain. People who think they own you never stop trying. Later that night, Richard returned to the city. His townhouse felt smaller than before, but lighter somehow, as if purpose had swept the dust away. He poured himself a drink, opened his notebook, and began drafting a new version of his will. Not out of bitterness, but precision. He wanted to leave behind something that couldn't be twisted, not just money or property, but message. That a black man's legacy could be defined by his own design, not diluted by someone else's comfort. When he finished, he closed the notebook and turned off the lamp. The house fell into silence, but it wasn't the lonely kind anymore. It was the silence of control, deliberate, complete, and unafraid. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady, washing the city clean for whatever came next. They came on a Sunday. The air was bright and brittle, the kind of morning that smelled like pine and arrogance. Richard saw the first SUV roll through the gate from his vantage point on the upper balcony, a silver Lexus with the confidence of ownership. A second car followed, packed to the roof with boxes and folded furniture. He didn't move. Not yet. He had known they'd come eventually. People like Daniel's family didn't believe in permission, only in the inevitability of their presence. The first to step out was Margaret Whitmore, draped in linen, as if the world existed for her comfort. She turned in a slow circle, surveying the lake, the house, the air. "Oh, it's even lovelier than I remembered," she said, her voice carrying upward. Daniel came next, sleeves rolled, the posture of a man pretending humility. "We'll keep it exactly as it is," he told her, though the movers behind him were already unwrapping furniture that wasn't Richard's. Amelia emerged last, her hair tied back her face, set with that expression of forced composure she wore when she didn't want to think too much. She looked up toward the balcony, saw her father standing there, and froze. "Dad," she said, the word more startled than respectful. Richard didn't answer. He just looked at her, calm, silent, unreadable. Daniel climbed a few steps toward the front door. "Mr. Coleman, we didn't think you'd be here so soon. We figured you were still in Oakland." "I wasn't," Richard said simply. Margaret adjusted her sunglasses. "Well, since you're here, maybe you can help us get settled. The movers are asking where to put everything." "This isn't a hotel," Richard said, voice low but even. Margaret's smile thinned. "We're family now, aren't we?" "No need to be territorial. Territory," Richard said, "is how civilizations survive." Daniel stepped in, hands raised like a peacekeeper. "Let's not make this uncomfortable. Amelia and I already agreed this would be a shared space for everyone." Richard's gaze slid to his daughter. "You agreed," he said quietly. "Not me." Amelia swallowed, her voice soft but firm. "We talked about this, Dad. I told you they needed a place. You told me Richard said. You didn't ask me." Margaret chuckled, that kind of laughter used by people who never learned what fear sounds like. "Goodness, Richard, surely you're not angry about family using the place once in a while. We'll take good care of it, maybe even make some improvements." "Improvements," Richard repeated the word, tasting like rust. "The last time someone said that to me, they bulldozed a neighborhood." The movers hesitated, glancing between them. The tension hung in the air like static. Richard stepped forward slowly, his expression still composed. "You can leave the boxes by the door," he said to the movers. "No one's moving in today." Daniel's polite mask cracked. "Richard, let's be reasonable. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to build family unity." Richard's eyes sharpened. Unity without consent is occupation. For the first time, silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Margaret's voice cut through, crisp and sharp. "You're overreacting. You have other houses. Why not let us enjoy this one?" Richard smiled faintly, almost pitying. You enjoy a thing when it's given, not taken. Daniel turned toward Amelia, seeking her support. Say something, honey. She met her father's eyes. There was a flicker there, maybe guilt, maybe exhaustion. Dad, please don't make this ugly. I just want peace. Peace, Richard said, his voice now softer. Deadlier comes after respect, not before. He turned, stepped back inside, and pressed a single button on his phone. At first nothing happened. Then slowly the house responded. Lights along the hallway shifted tone warmer, dimmer. The air vents opened with a low hum. Soft instrumental music began playing from hidden speakers, a melody Claire once loved. Margaret frowned. Is that classical? Daniel tried to laugh. Your dad's setting the mood. But then the front door closed gently, deliberately on its own. The lock clicked, a sound subtle but final. Margaret turned, startled. Did you just... Richard's voice came from the overhead speaker, calm and detached. This house recognizes its owner. Amelia froze. Dad, what are you doing? Teaching boundaries, Richard said. The shutters began to lower one by one, the sunlight dimming as the villa sealed itself. The soft music shifted from melody to the faint echo of water waves' wind. It wasn't threatening, not exactly. It was commanding. Daniel grabbed the doorknob. Hey, this isn't funny. The system responded automatically. Unauthorized access detected. Margaret backed away. Richard, stop this at once. Stop what? Richard asked through the intercom. My house doing what it was built to do. The lighting changed again, cool blue tracing along the walls like veins of calm power. The temperature dropped a few degrees. Even Amelia, who had grown up in those rooms, didn't recognize the house anymore. Dad, she said, voice trembling, you're scaring them. No, he replied. I'm reminding them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Richard disengaged the system. The lights warmed again. The doors unlocked. Margaret exhaled shakily, her confidence fractured. Daniel mumbled something about needing to come back later. They gathered their things, speaking in short, clipped tones. Amelia lingered last, eyes red, shoulders tight. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I did, Richard replied. Because words don't work anymore. She stared at him, hurt, furious, confused. What happened to the man who used to teach me patience? He built this house, Richard said, and watched you hand it to strangers. Then he turned away, leaving her to stand in the doorway as the others drove off, engines, loud, hearts louder. When the dust finally settled, Richard stood at the terrace alone. The lake gleamed below, calm, reflective. The house hummed softly behind him, alive and loyal. For the first time in weeks, he breathed without weight. They had come with entitlement. He had answered with ownership. And the villa, his and Claire's creation, had remembered who it belonged to. Night fell like a verdict. By dusk, the Whitmores had returned this time with determination. Their 2 SUVs rolled into the gravel drive like invaders reclaiming conquered land. Margaret's pearls caught the headlights sharp and glinting. Daniel moved briskly, barking orders to the movers who trailed behind with boxes. Richard watched from the second-floor window, silent as a statue. He'd known they wouldn't let humiliation sit quietly. People like them never did. They mistook politeness for surrender. He waited until the last light of sunset slipped off the lake before pressing the code on his phone. The villa stirred. Downstairs, Derek's system came alive, soft clicks and hums, traveling through walls, a pulse of energy running along the floors like memory waking up. The lights dimmed to a low amber glow. The temperature dropped by 3 degrees. The house recognized intrusion. Daniel fumbled for a switch. Did someone forget to pay the power bill? The lights flickered, then steadied only above Richard's portrait in the hall. It had been Claire's favorite photo of him standing by the lake, wearing his old work gloves, pride in his eyes. Margaret squinted up at it. Well, she muttered, that's unsettling. Amelia turned toward the stairs, her voice shaking slightly. Dad, if you're doing this, please stop. We just want to talk. Richard didn't answer. Instead, the speakers embedded in the ceiling came alive, faint at first like the whisper of air. Then came the sound Claire's voice recorded years ago for the home's smart system. Welcome to Lakeview Villa. Please respect the property. The Whitmores froze. Is that Daniel? Began. It's Claire, Amelia whispered. Her mother's voice floated through the halls again. This home was built with care and consent. Trespassing voids both. Daniel laughed nervously. Cute. Very dramatic. Margaret didn't laugh. She clutched her purse closer, eyes darting toward the door. "Turn that off, Richard," she shouted. The house responded automatically. Command not recognized. Daniel moved toward the control panel near the door. "I'll just reset it." The panel beeped. A mechanical voice replied. "Unauthorized access detected. Lockdown mode activated." The front door sealed with a low mechanical thud. Amelia gasped. "Dad, enough." But the system wasn't cruel, it was precise. Lights illuminated the floor path leading to the exit, guiding them like a calm escort. Yet every time Daniel tried to reach a door or window, it slid shut ahead of him, glass reflecting his own frustration back at him. "Richard, this is insane," he yelled. "You can't trap people in here." Trap Richard's voice finally echoed through the speakers, smooth, quiet, and cold. "You trapped yourselves the moment you decided my absence meant permission." The villa hummed louder now, the low, resonant sound of air through vents and steel reinforcement. Margaret dropped onto the couch, pale. "This is barbaric," she whispered. "You're scaring your own daughter." Richard's voice softened. "My daughter stopped being scared of losing me a long time ago. Maybe it's time she learns to fear losing herself." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The sound of the lake filtered faintly through the glass, a soft rhythm of water against shore. Then gradually the villa began to release them. One door unlatched, another window unlocked. The temperature warmed by a few degrees. Richard descended the stairs. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wore no anger, only control. Amelia looked at him with wide eyes. "What are you doing, Dad?" "I'm teaching," he said simply. Daniel stepped forward. "You're insane." "No," Richard said, stopping inches from him. "I'm remembering, and so is the house." He gestured toward the walls. "Every inch of this place was built by my hands and hers." His eyes flicked toward Amelia. "Your mother's laughter is in this wood. My sweat in these floors. You can't overwrite that with entitlement." Amelia's eyes glistened. "We just wanted to belong." "You did," he said, "until you tried to belong more than the people who built you." Silence filled the room, heavy but clean. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake, low, distant, promising rain. Margaret stood abruptly. "We're leaving," she said. "You should," Richard replied, "before the house starts correcting itself again." Daniel grabbed her arm, muttering under his breath as they gathered their things. Amelia lingered near the doorway, trembling between fury and shame. "Dad," she began. He didn't look at her. "If you want peace, Amelia, earn it, not by asking the world to forget what made you." Her chin quivered. "You think this is about race?" He looked at her for the first time. His expression was tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Everything in this country is about race, even the silence." She turned away, her breath hitching. Then she left. The cars pulled out one by one, tail lights fading into the dark. Rain began to fall slow at first, then steady, washing the dust from the driveway, filling the air with petrichor and justice. Richard stood in the doorway, watching until the last sound of engines disappeared. Then he whispered to the empty air, "Good girl, Claire. You built a house that remembers." The villa's lights dimmed to their natural warmth again, the hum fading to a steady rhythm. Peace returned, but not the fragile kind. This peace was earned, fortified, awake. He closed the door gently behind him. Outside, lightning flashed over the water, white and clean, cutting the night in half. And inside, for the first time in years, Richard Coleman allowed himself to smile. Morning came gray and unsettled, the kind of sky that promised more trouble. Richard woke to the sound of distant knocking, not the careful kind, the kind that demanded attention. He moved downstairs, robe tied loosely, coffee mug in hand. When he opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, one young, eager, the other older, expression unreadable. Behind them, Daniel and Margaret Whitmore waited, wrapped in coats and indignation. Mr. Coleman, the older officer, asked, "We received a call about possible harassment and unlawful confinement on this property." Margaret stepped forward immediately. "He locked us inside, officer. We were terrified." There's something wrong with his system. It's dangerous. Richard met her gaze calmly. The only thing wrong here is entitlement. Daniel clenched his jaw. We have every right to be here. My wife's father. Your wife's father is standing in front of you, Richard said, cutting him off. And you're trespassing. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, they're saying you intentionally trapped them in the house. I didn't trap anyone, Richard replied evenly. My home security system detected unauthorized access. It locked down automatically as programmed. They were free to leave once I deactivated it. Margaret scoffed. That's absurd. You frightened us. Richard turned to the officer. Fear is not the same as harm. The words hung between them sharp as glass. The older officer raised a brow. Is there surveillance footage? Every second, Richard said. You're welcome to review it. That seemed to quiet things. The younger officer followed him inside, notebook in hand, while Daniel and Margaret hovered near the porch, muttering about overreactions and unstable behavior. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and rain. The villa was calm, serene, the exact opposite of the chaos they described. Derek's system had already logged the entire sequence. Richard opened the control console and tapped a few commands. The screen lit up with footage Margaret entering first. Daniel trying the doors, the voice prompts warning them of unauthorized access. The guided exit lights the final release sequence. Nothing violent, nothing unlawful, just precision. The younger officer watched silently, then exhaled. Looks like the system worked exactly as intended. Exactly, Richard said. Now tell me what's the law for trespassing when you're told to leave and refuse? The officer looked uncomfortable. Technically, it's still trespassing, sir. Technically, Richard repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. That word saves a lot of people from accountability. They wrapped up quickly after that. The officers took notes, promised to file a report, and advised everyone involved to communicate peacefully. Margaret demanded they make Richard disable the system entirely. The officers declined. When they left, Daniel threw one last look over his shoulder. You're making a mistake, Richard. People talk. Once they hear about this, you'll look like the aggressor. I've looked worse to better men, Richard said, and closed the door. By noon, the first whispers reached him. Online posts, half-formed, slanted, already framed the story differently. Elderly man terrorizes daughter's in-laws. Wealthy black homeowner detains white family in smart house malfunction. No one mentioned trespassing. No one mentioned ownership. It spread faster than he could read. Photos of the villa surfaced, elegant, isolated, perfect for scandal. Journalists called for comment. Some asked polite questions. Others asked loaded ones. He declined them all. Marcus Eng called that evening voice tight with frustration. I told you this might happen. You win in reality and they fight you in perception. I'm used to it, Richard said. But this isn't just gossip, Marcus warned. It's narrative warfare. They'll twist the facts until you're the villain. Richard sipped his coffee. Let them. Villains get remembered. Quiet men don't. Marcus sighed. You're still protected legally, but the court of opinion. Never liked me anyway, Richard finished. Doesn't matter. The house stands. That's enough. There was silence on the line. Then Marcus said quietly, You sound like Claire when she used to argue zoning codes. Calm on the surface, ready to detonate underneath. Richard smiled faintly. She taught me everything worth learning. That night he walked the villa's perimeter slow and deliberate. The air smelled of wet grass and cold metal. He checked every door, every lock, every camera. The system pulsed gently alive, but at rest, like a loyal animal waiting for command. He thought of Amelia's silence since yesterday. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. Maybe she was hiding behind Daniel's anger or Margaret's fear. Or maybe she didn't know how to face what she'd seen. Richard didn't blame her. Shame had its own gravity. It pulled harder than guilt. He paused by the edge of the lake, moonlight trembling across the surface. Claire used to say water never forgets, it just reflects differently each day. He knelt, touched the cold surface with his fingertips, and murmured, They can spin stories all they want. The truth's right here. The reflection in the lake looked back, his face strong-lined, dark against the ripples. He'd been many things to many people. Builder, husband, father problem headline. But beneath all that, he was still the same man who poured foundations with his own hands, who believed that walls could hold memory if built with love. He stood, brushed the moisture from his fingers, and turned toward the villa, his fortress, his confession, his last word. Inside, the lights glowed softly, as if waiting for him to come home. By midweek, Richard's world had become noise. Headlines, hashtags, commentary from strangers who pronounced judgment with the confidence of gods and the attention span of moths. He didn't watch the news, but he couldn't escape it. Every ping on his phone was another opinion disguised as fact. Arrogant property mogul terrorizes family. Tech glitch exposes racial bias in automated home. Sources claim mental decline behind smart house incident. Even the photos told their own story, one shot of him standing on the terrace, caught by a telephoto lens framed to look like a man guarding a fortress instead of a man defending his home. Marcus called daily, now his tone, part lawyer, part brother. "They're building a narrative," he said. "You need to control it before it controls you." "I'm not auditioning for anyone's sympathy," Richard said. "Sympathy isn't the goal," Marcus replied. "Credibility is." Richard sighed. "If credibility depended on truth, we'd both be out of work." That evening, the first reporter showed up, a young white woman in a trench coat standing by the gate, microphone in hand. "Mr. Coleman, would you like to make a statement?" she called. "There are allegations that the house was racially programmed, that your system discriminated against your daughter's in-laws." Richard almost laughed. "Racially programmed," he repeated to himself. "They can't imagine the house obeyed me by choice." He closed the gate. No comment. But the footage aired anyway. Edited, cropped. His refusal became arrogance. His silence became guilt. A few nights later, he met with Derek and Pastor Raymond in the villa's kitchen. The three men sat around the wooden table Claire had chosen decades earlier, the same one where she'd once drawn sketches and shared coffee. Derek scrolled through a feed on his tablet. "It's bad, Rich. They've got talking heads debating whether you weaponize technology. Sounds like they're allergic to the idea of a black man with boundaries," Raymond said. Richard rubbed his temples. "Let them talk." Raymond leaned forward. "Talk becomes record. Record becomes myth. You don't get to be silent forever." Richard met his gaze. "I've spent 60 years speaking carefully and still being misunderstood. Silence at least keeps me honest." Derek nodded, thoughtful. "Then let the house speak for you. The logs, the footage, the truth." Richard smiled faintly. "You still believe truth wins. I believe truth doesn't need to win," Derek said. "It just needs to survive." Later that night, Richard sat alone in the living room. The villa was dark except for the fireplace, soft orange light flickering against framed photographs. Claire, Amelia at 5, holding a paintbrush twice her size. The three of them on the day the roof was finished, grinning like they'd built the world. He remembered that day clearly, the sound of hammers, the smell of new wood, the pride in Claire's eyes. "This house will outlast gossip," she'd said once, teasing him about his cautious nature. "You can't cancel craftsmanship." He'd believed her then. Now he wasn't sure. He turned on the TV out of reflex, a mistake. His face filled the screen immediately under the headline, "The Lakeview Lockdown Race, Wealth and Control." Two panelists argued, "He's a symbol of old power." "No, he's a man protecting. What's his? He used fear as a weapon. He used fear as a shield." Richard muted the sound. Watching them dissect him like a case study felt surreal, as if he were both alive and autopsied. He poured himself a drink and stared at the silent screen. The image of his house, his life's work, glowed behind the anchor's voice. It looked foreign now, like someone else's legacy. The next morning a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. He recognized the handwriting before he even opened it. "Dad, I don't know what to say anymore. Everything is spinning out of control. Daniel's parents are humiliated, and I'm angry, but not at you. Maybe at myself. Maybe at all of it. People keep asking me to defend you, and I don't know how. I don't even know if you want me to. You've always been so proud, so strong, and I thought that made you invincible. But now I see how much weight you've carried. I didn't understand what it cost you to build this life. Maybe I didn't want to understand. I'm not ready to face you yet, but I'm not siding against you either. I just need time. Please don't shut me out forever." Amelia Richard read it twice, then again, each time slower. For the first time since this began, something in him softened, not forgiveness, not yet but recognition. The letter was raw, uncertain, imperfect. But it was hers. And it was real. He folded it carefully and slid it into his pocket. That evening, the villa felt different, quieter. Not the silence of tension, but of reckoning. Richard sat on the porch as dusk fell. The air was cool, the lake a mirror of soft violet and gold. Somewhere across the water, thunder murmured distant but inevitable. He thought about legacy, not the kind written on deeds or broadcast in headlines, but the kind carried through blood and memory. Maybe this was how healing began, not with apology or victory, but with exhaustion. He whispered to the fading sky, "She's still my daughter, Claire, still ours." And for the first time in a long time, he felt the house settle its quiet hum, no longer defensive, but protective, a living thing learning to rest again. The morning of the signing was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made the lake look like glass. Richard woke before sunrise dressed in his best Navy suit and drove into town with the calm precision of a man who'd already fought the hardest battle and won. The notary's office sat on the corner of Main and 4th, tucked between a bakery and an antique shop. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper ink and the strange neutrality of bureaucracy. Marcus Eng was already there, seated at a polished oak table. Across from him sat Pastor Raymond, who would serve as the witness. They both stood as Richard entered. Marcus adjusted his tie. "Morning, Richard. You ready to make this official? As ready as I'll ever be." Raymond smiled faintly. "I haven't seen you in a suit since Claire's memorial." "Different kind of funeral," Richard replied. Marcus slid the documents across the table, a thick stack of legal pages marked with color-coded tabs. "This will establish the Coleman Foundation for Housing Justice as the permanent owner of the Lakeview Villa. You'll retain lifetime usage rights, but when you pass, the property transitions directly into community trust. No heirs, no challenges." Richard nodded. "Perfect." The notary, a quiet middle-aged woman with silver glasses, began reading through the terms aloud. Her tone was practiced, impersonal, but each word landed heavy with meaning. Irrevocable, transfer of ownership, lifetime clause. When she finished, she looked up. "Mr. Coleman, do you understand that once you sign, this property can no longer be inherited or reclaimed by any individual, including family?" "I do." "Do you sign willingly?" "I do." She nodded, slid the pen toward him. For a moment, Richard hesitated. His fingers rested on the pen, the ink glinting under the fluorescent light. He thought of Claire, her laugh echoing through unfinished walls, her paint-splattered hands pressed to his cheek the day they first broke ground. He thought of Amelia's small hand wrapped around his when she was 5, asking Daddy, "Can we live here forever?" Maybe he thought this was the only way for forever to mean something. He signed. Each stroke of his name felt like a boundary, solidifying, not closing a reclamation, not a surrender. When it was done, the notary stamped the final page and said softly, "Congratulations, Mr. Coleman. It's official." Raymond exhaled, smiling with quiet pride. "You turned a house into a legacy." Richard glanced at Marcus. "Now it belongs to something that can't be ashamed of me." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "You sure you don't want to leave a provision for Amelia?" "Something symbolic." "This is symbolic," Richard said. "She'll understand one day. Maybe not now, but one day." Raymond nodded. "Sometimes love looks like law." Afterward, they walked together to the cafe next door. Marcus ordered coffee. Raymond bought a box of pastries for the road. They sat by the window overlooking the quiet street. "You know, Marcus said you just made every real estate attorney in the county double-check their clients' wills." Richard chuckled. "Good. Let them learn what ownership really means." Raymond lifted his cup. "To dignity," he said. "To finality," Richard added. They clinked their cups together. That evening, Richard returned to the villa. The drive was peaceful. The storm had passed, leaving the world rinsed clean. The house greeted him the moment he walked in, lights adjusting gentle warmth spreading through the floorboards. He moved through the rooms slowly, touching walls, frames, furniture, every piece of memory now belonging to something larger than himself. In the main hallway, he stopped before Claire's portrait. "It's done," he said softly. "They can't take it now. Not you. Not us." The lights in the room seemed to flicker in response just once, brief but noticeable, as if the house understood. He smiled. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, Amelia stood there. Her eyes were red, her face pale. "I heard what you did," she said. "The foundation, the signing." Richard nodded. "Word travels fast." She stepped inside, slowly looking around as though seeing the house for the first time, not as inheritance, but as history. "You really gave it away. I gave it back," he said. She swallowed. "I thought you wanted me to have this someday. I wanted you to deserve it," he said gently. "But you're not ready. Maybe you will be when you stop seeing this house as property and start seeing it as proof." Tears welled in her eyes. "Proof of what? That we existed," he said. "That we built something worth remembering." For a long time she said nothing. Then quietly, "I'm sorry." He nodded. "That's a start." They stood together by the window looking out at the lake. The water shimmered with twilight light, gold fading into blue. Amelia whispered, "Mom would have hated how far we drifted." Richard's voice softened. "She'd have found a way to paint it into something beautiful." For the first time in years, they stood close without words, just breathing the same quiet air. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was proximity, the beginning of repair. Outside the house, lights dimmed automatically, bathing them in soft warmth. The villa, it seemed, approved. The morning after the signing, Amelia woke before dawn. She hadn't really slept, only drifted in and out of half-dreams where her father's voice echoed through empty rooms, calm and steady, the way he always sounded right before the ground shifted beneath you. She sat in her car outside the villa, the engine off, watching mist drift over the lake. The silence pressed on her chest like guilt made tangible. For the first time in her life, she was afraid to walk through that door. When she finally did, the house greeted her quietly. No alarms, no voice commands, no hum of resistance. The air was still almost kind, as if the house had already forgiven her, even if its owner hadn't. Richard was in the kitchen reading the newspaper, like the world hadn't just turned upside down. He looked up when she entered but didn't speak. Amelia hesitated. "You didn't answer my calls." He folded the paper neatly. "I figured you needed silence more than answers." She stepped closer, her voice unsteady. "I heard about the foundation. You really meant it." "I always mean what I build," Richard said. She sank into the chair across from him. "You made me look like a fool." "No," he said evenly. "You made choices that did that for you." Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand how it felt trying to belong in Daniel's world. His family, his friends. They always looked at me like I was lucky he married me. I just wanted to prove..." To who Richard interrupted softly. "Them or yourself?" Her breath caught. "Both, I guess." He studied her carefully. The woman she'd become polished, brittle, still carrying the same pride he once mistook for strength. "You wanted to be seen," he said. "And somewhere along the way you thought the price was distance from me." She stared down at her hands. "Maybe I did. Maybe I thought loving you openly made life harder." He didn't flinch, but his voice dropped lower. "Because I'm black." The words hung between them like a blade. Amelia's throat tightened. "That's not fair." "It's true," he said quietly. "And truth doesn't have to be fair." She blinked hard, tears threatening. "You think I'm ashamed of you? I think you learned to be," he said. "The world taught you that. I just didn't unteach it fast enough." Amelia pressed her palms against her eyes. "You have no idea what it was like trying to live in both worlds, one that pretends color doesn't matter, and another that never lets you forget it does. I was tired, Dad. I wanted peace." "Peace isn't pretending," Richard said. "It's surviving without losing yourself." Her voice broke. "Then maybe I never learned how." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw not defiance but exhaustion. Beneath the layers of pride and performance was a woman terrified of what she'd become. He softened. "You're not your mistakes, Amelia. You're what you do after them." She met his gaze. "And what do I do now?" You've taken away the house, the name, the inheritance. What's left for me?" He leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "You still have a father. If you want one." She swallowed hard. "You'd still have me after everything I've already lost enough," he said. "I don't need to lose my daughter, too." Tears spilled down her cheeks, then quiet, unceremonious. "I thought you'd never forgive me." He exhaled. "Forgiveness isn't a gift. It's work. We can start there." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the clock filling the space between breaths. Outside light began to stretch across the lake, pale gold on silver water. Amelia wiped her eyes and whispered, "Mom would have been proud of you." He smiled faintly. "Your mother would have been furious with both of us first." That broke the tension. She laughed, small, broken, but real. The kind of laugh that cracks grief's shell just enough to let air in. Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "Claire always said, legacy isn't what we leave behind, but who we leave standing." Amelia looked at their joined hands, one dark, one light, both marked by time. "Then I want to stand," she said softly. "Teach me how." Richard nodded. "Start by remembering where you came from. The rest will follow." Later they walked down to the lake together. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. Amelia picked up a flat rock and skipped it across the surface, something she hadn't done since childhood. The ripples spread wide and smooth, the water swallowing each circle without protest. "Do you think Mom forgave us?" she asked. Richard looked out at the horizon. If she built this house, she built forgiveness into it somewhere. They stood side by side, the villa behind them glowing in the soft light. The house had witnessed betrayal, defiance, and now something closer to understanding. Amelia turned to him, her expression fragile but sincere. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I almost did," Richard admitted. "But your mother would have haunted me." She smiled through her tears. "She still might." For a long moment they just stood there, father and daughter, framed by water and silence, the weight between them finally shifting into something that could be carried. Above the lake, the morning sun rose clean and slow, washing color back into the world. It began as a whisper of smoke. Richard smelled it first, faint, acidic, the ghost of something burning far away. He thought it was just a neighbor's chimney, or maybe a leaf pile gone astray. But then Derek's security alert buzzed on his phone. "Thermal anomaly detected south perimeter." He moved fast. By the time he reached the back terrace, orange light was already blooming beyond the trees. The wind carried the unmistakable crackle of fire, hungry, alive, and close. "Amelia," he shouted, "get the emergency pack!" She ran from the hallway, barefoot, clutching her mother's photo album. "What's happening?" "Someone said it," he said, voice grim. "We have to go now." The villa's smart system had already engaged defense mode metal shutters, dropping sprinklers, activating along the roofline, but the fire was too fast, too intentional. Flames raced through the dry brush like they'd been waiting for permission. Richard grabbed the emergency drive, the digital heart of the Coleman Foundation, and shoved it into his pocket. Move toward the lake. They ran through the smoke, coughing the world around them, glowing in shades of gold and terror. Amelia stumbled, choking as embers rained down. Richard caught her arm and pulled her close. "Keep low. Don't look back." But she did, and what she saw broke her. The villa, her mother's masterpiece, her father's fortress, was already engulfed. The roof crackled, beams collapsing inward. The house that had survived storms, prejudice, and betrayal now burned like a confession. She screamed, "Dad, I know." His voice was steady but shaking. "It's just a house." "No," she cried. "It's home." He turned her face toward the water. "Then carry it with you." They reached the lake's edge just as the sirens wailed in the distance. Fire crews would come too late to save the structure, but maybe not too late to save what mattered. Richard guided Amelia knee-deep into the cold water. Smoke curled overhead like black ribbons against the sky. Behind them, the villa's silhouette wavered and collapsed, a sound like thunderwood giving up its last strength. Amelia wept openly now, her tears mixing with the lake. Who would do this? Richard didn't answer, but in his mind he saw the headlines, the gossip, the resentment his stand had provoked. The story had made him a symbol, and symbols made easy targets. When the firefighters finally arrived, they found the two of them standing silently in the water, watching the house burn down to its foundation. Hours later, when the flames were gone and the first gray light crept over the horizon, Richard walked through the wreckage with the fire chief. "Gasoline traces along the south fence," the chief said. "This wasn't an accident." Richard nodded. "I know. We'll investigate. Might take time." "Time's the only thing I've got left," Richard said quietly. Amelia stood a few yards away, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with soot. She looked smaller somehow, as if the fire had taken years from her. When he approached, she whispered, "Everything's gone." He shook his head. "Not everything." He pulled the small drive from his pocket and placed it in her hand. "The foundation records, the legal transfers, all safe." She looked at him bewildered. "You thought to grab that." He smiled faintly. "I built this place twice. I know what matters the second time." She laughed through her tears, a hollow sound, but real. "You're unbelievable. Stubborn," he corrected. "There's a difference." By afternoon, news crews had arrived. Cameras framed the ruins in cinematic sorrow, the story reborn as tragedy. Coleman Villa destroyed in suspected arson. Community icon targeted after racial controversy. Strangers laid flowers by the gate. Others came just to take pictures. The same people who'd condemned him days ago now called him resilient, heroic, a man wronged. Richard watched them from a distance, unmoved. "They always show up for ashes," he muttered. Amelia turned to him. "What will you do now?" He looked out at the blackened frame of his home still smoldering. "Rebuild. Not the same way, not for walls. For meaning." She frowned softly. "How do you rebuild meaning?" "With memory," he said, "and with people willing to face what burned it down." She squeezed his hand. "Then, let's start together." That night, when everyone had gone and the lake reflected only faint moonlight, Richard walked to what had been the living room, now just a field of ash and twisted metal. He knelt, pressed a hand to the cold ground and whispered, "You did your job. You kept us safe." A breeze stirred, lifting bits of soot into the air like black snow. He could almost hear Claire's voice in it, warm, teasing. "You built walls, Richard. Now build bridges." He stood slowly, the glow of dying embers painting his face in soft red light. "All right, Claire," he murmured. "One more project." Behind him, the lake shimmered quietly, patient, eternal, waiting to reflect whatever would come next. A year later, there was no trace of the fire. Grass had grown over the ashes, wildflowers pushing through where floorboards once stood. The lake shimmered as it always had, indifferent to loss, faithful to reflection. On that same ground, a new structure began to rise. Smaller, simpler, built from reclaimed timber and steel. No grandeur, no facade of wealth, just a home that breathed. Richard stood at the edge of the site, hands in his coat pockets, watching the construction team work. Every sound, the ring of hammers, the hum of saws, felt like a heartbeat. Amelia joined him, wearing a hard hat that didn't quite fit. "You said you didn't want to rebuild," she teased. "I said I didn't want to rebuild the same way," he replied. "This isn't a monument, it's a start." She nodded. "The community fund's already halfway to its goal. The scholarship applications doubled this month." "Good," he said. "Means the foundation's alive." She hesitated. "And you?" He smiled faintly, still breathing. "That's enough for now." They watched as a young black architect, a recent graduate from the foundation's pilot program, directed the workers with calm authority. Her name was Kiana Ellis, and she had grown up in the same city where Richard once fought zoning boards that refused him permits. Now she was leading his project. When she noticed him watching, she waved shyly. Richard tipped his hat. Amelia whispered, "She reminds me of Mom." "She reminds me of what Mom hoped for," Richard said. That afternoon, a small crowd gathered, neighbors, donors, students. They came not for ceremony, but for participation. Each was given a small stone with a word engraved, "Justice, Memory, Home, Belonging." Richard had insisted on it. "Every foundation starts with intention," he'd said. One by one, people placed their stones into the new foundation trench. When it was Richard's turn, he held his stone a long moment. His word was, restoration. He knelt and set it carefully among the others. When he stood, applause rippled through the air, soft, genuine. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Amelia found him by the water's edge. The sky was pale pink, the horizon brushed with gold. She said quietly, "You know, for a long time I thought your silence was pride. Now I see it was patience." He chuckled. "That's generous. It was mostly exhaustion." She smiled. "I'm proud of you." He turned to her. "Don't be proud of me. Be better than me. I'm trying. That's all it takes." They stood together watching the construction lights flicker on as evening settled. The house, or what would soon be one, stood outlined against the sky like a promise written in blueprints. Amelia slipped her hand into his. "Do you ever miss the old house every day?" he said. "But grief's just proof we built something worth losing." Weeks later, the first walls went up. Richard visited daily, walking the perimeter, checking the progress. Kiana often joined him, discussing design details, airflow, insulation, accessibility. One afternoon, she said, "Mr. Coleman, we could install a memorial plaque by the entrance. Something that honors what stood here before." He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No plaque. The building is the memory. Let people feel it, not read it." Kiana smiled. "I like that." When spring came, the new villa, though smaller, humbler, stood complete. It faced the lake just as the old one had, but this time its wide windows opened fully to the world. At the opening ceremony, no speeches were made. Instead, a young choir from the foundation sang an old spiritual Deep River. Their voices filled the air with something ancient and unbroken. Richard stood in the doorway beside Amelia. "Claire would have liked this," he said softly. "She'd say you finally learned to let light in." Amelia replied. He smiled. "She'd probably be right." That night, long after everyone had gone, Richard walked through the empty rooms alone. He ran his fingers along the smooth wood of the walls, the quiet hum of the new system. Simple human. Nothing to weaponize. He paused in what would become his study. The moonlight spilled through the open window, falling across the floor in silver lines. From his pocket, he pulled a single object, the charred remains of one of Claire's old paintbrushes. He'd found it in the ashes after the fire. He placed it on the windowsill. "You see, Claire," he whispered, "we built it again. Only this time, it belongs to everyone." He stayed there a while, breathing in the quiet. Outside, the lake mirrored the stars perfectly, as if erasing every scar that came before. The next morning, Amelia found him on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. "Can I stay for a while?" she asked. "You don't need permission anymore," he said. She smiled. "Feels strange, no fences, no locks." "That's the point," he said. "It's not about keeping anyone out anymore. It's about letting them in." They sat together in silence as light spilled over the water, painting the new house gold. For the first time in years, Richard felt no weight on his chest, no need to defend or explain. The world would keep spinning with all its unfairness and noise, but here on this ground, in this moment, there was peace. He exhaled slowly and whispered, "We're home."